Hello everybody and welcome back to Kerbal Space Program Beyond Horizons. We are currently looking at Space Bus 1. I have an investor tour to do to take him around the Space Center, so I thought I'd create like a little futuristic bus to do so. And yes, as you can see there, I made functional indicators because I have too much time on my hands and no life. There's our investor. He wants us to build a space hotel, but I don't know why he's just stood staring at the wall like that. That's a bit creepy. Anyway, they also gave him a little spacesuit. I don't know why the investor's wearing a spacesuit, but anyway. Yes, he wants us to build a space hotel, which I thought would be quite fun to do. The other alternative is a casino, but I don't really know how a casino works in space. I think the roulette table would be a bit defunct. This investor contract will hail in a new era of tourism for our space program. No longer will we take tourists in cheap shuttles to the Beluga where they don't really have much room to enjoy themselves. No, now we will build a huge space hotel and give them all of the amenities that comes with that. And to make this worthwhile, we'll be investing in a lot of infrastructure as well around the Kerbal system to make this a bit easier. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. For now, we have to, well, show this investor that it's worth giving us the money to build this hotel. I had a lot of fun building this bus, probably more fun than I should have. I don't know, I was just driving around the Space Center using my indicators and I was really enjoying myself, which probably says something about me, but I don't care, it was fun. Anyway, clearly the investor was pleased because we did get the hotel contract, which we'll be starting pretty shortly. Now, if you'll remember in the last episode, we finally managed to bring the flower home, and so the crew need returning back to the surface. And I thought that this would be, well, quite the endurance test for the Hawk shuttle, so instead of just building a cheap little capsule, I thought, why not use the Hawk? I'll tell you why not use the Hawk, because it was really difficult. It was a very hard way of doing this. I could have just built like a small little rocket and done this kind of easier, but I don't know. I really like the Hawk shuttle. I think it's good fun to use. Unfortunately, I couldn't really take many cinematics of this because it required such attention. You can see there we're actually orbiting against the rotation of the planet and putting ourselves in a very inclined orbit. So I started and restarted this flight about 5 or 6 times because the shuttle doesn't actually have enough fuel to do any inclination changes. So I had to make sure that I was, on a correct heading from launch, which required rotating the whole craft in the vehicle assembly building first. So yeah, that took me a few tries to get right. Yeah, even though the Hawk usually has quite a good amount of delta V left after orbital insertion, this was not an orbit where I had much margin for error. The main issue of the orbit that we're trying to reach is, as I said, it is against the rotation of the planet, so we actually use up a lot of our fuel first, cancelling out the velocity that being on the surface of the planet gives us, and then from there trying to reach orbit. So it is more expensive to get into these kind of orbits. So we have about 500 meters per second of delta V left, which wasn't enough to force an encounter or, kind of encourage an encounter. So instead, what you'll see me do is wait quite a few orbits just to passively get close. And then from there, we can kind of tweak our trajectory to get close to the flower. And then we begin the dizzying process of orbiting until we get to that maneuver node. I also noticed that being in a polar orbit is actually quite bad for radiation because I think the radiation is channeled into the poles. I'm not too sure about what the shape of the magnetosphere is around Kerbin, but it seems to be stronger at the poles. We were getting a lot more warning messages than normal. But with the maneuver node complete, it's now just a matter of waiting until we arrive at the flower. There we are, just polishing off our rendezvous with the flower, the crew of which I have no doubt are eagerly looking out the windows at their ride home. As I said last episode, they've been in space for about a year and 190 days, so yeah, they are probably very excited to come back home. Now there, I've just transferred all the fuel from the Bumblebee lander into the main vessel of the Flower. The reason I've done that is because the Hawk has basically no fuel left and certainly won't be able to fly itself back to the Space Center, so we're basically going to steal fuel from the Bumblebee lander and let that drift in orbit by itself forever and ever. Anyway, here we are on final approach to the Flower. The docking went pretty much without a hitch. It was fairly routine. And as the two vessels dock together, the crew of the Flower breathe a sigh of relief as they can finally come home. There we are, the crew are all transferred onto the Hawk, and we've taken as much fuel as possible, which has given us a whole extra 90 meters per second of delta V, so hopefully that's enough to fly us back to the Space Center. This mission has really put the Hawk through its paces, and well, we're not done yet because, as I said, we are orbiting against the rotation of the planet, which means we are moving against the rotation of the atmosphere. This means that the relative velocity that we are encountering the atmosphere at is a lot higher than it otherwise would be in a normal equatorial orbit, which leads to higher temperatures on re-entry and bigger G-forces, and I was really worried the plane might not survive this re-entry. So to minimise the risk, I first did an aerobrake, so that is passing once through the atmosphere such that we just bring down our apoapsis without deorbiting completely, and then using what little fuel we have to circularize once again around the planet and then try and pick a good landing site to get back to the Space Center. And once again, the trajectories mod coming in clutch, helping us pick the landing site, because the planet is rotating underneath us, and so just because our trajectory passes over a certain bit of land does not mean that's where we'll actually be coming down. The re-entry itself went about as well as it could have. I did have to, pitch the nose up and down quite a lot to make sure we stayed on course for the Space Center. As we know, the Hawk has a tendency to glide quite well at high speeds and extend the range more than we need it to. Yeah, a lot of temperature gauges coming up. I was starting to bite my nails a little bit at this point. I thought, if something explodes, I do not have any contingencies in place and we will lose all of the crew. But luckily, that didn't happen and we survived the re-entry and came pretty damn close to the Space Center, close enough for us to use the air-breathing engines and fly back. You may recall a couple of episodes ago I was testing the Hawk Mark II. That project was scrapped because the plane just wasn't very well designed. I think adding the extra crew capacity made the thing quite nose heavy, and as the fuel drained, I just couldn't really get the center of lift in a good place to keep it stable. As well as that, the launch vehicle was just an absolute pain to make. It would never stay on course, even with a hinge on the main engine. Yeah, it was impossible to fly, so I scrapped the project. And in any case, I think this mission proves that the Hawk Mark I is just very reliable, and so it didn't really need replacing. But regardless, the crew of the Flower are finally home after well over a year in space, and they'll be taking a much needed vacation before they can get back to work. With the Space Hotel now fully operational, it's time to set up a bit more infrastructure so that we can actually get a pretty efficient tourism business. So here is the first of our orbital transfer systems. It's a little shuttle that will take tourists from Tavern 1 to the Space Hotel. With all of the science that we gathered in the last episode from the surface of Minmus, we have unlocked the Whiplash turbojet engine, which means we can start building honest-to-God SSTOs. I reckon a horizontal takeoff is probably a lot more comfortable for our passengers rather than a vertical takeoff. Although, that being said, that is how Blue Origin have been taking their passengers up into suborbital space flights. Yeah, using their vessel, the New Shepard, named after Alan Shepard, who I believe was the first American in space. They send tourists on suborbital space flights using, conventional vertical takeoff. Some of the notable passengers include Jeff Bezos and his brother, so I imagine ticket prices on such a trip are quite high. Anyway, there it is, the Betty, our little orbital bus, if you will. I think Betty's quite a bus name. And yeah, so her job will be to take tourists from Tavern 1 to Tavern 2, mainly because right now our SSTO capabilities don't go much further than low orbit, so we will need the Betty and possibly other orbital buses to make up the rest of the difference. And yeah, just taking a moment to appreciate the eclipse drawing over Kerbin's surface before we finish our rendezvous with Tavern 2, our space hotel. Yes, I thought I'd leave it at the hotel for now, and then we can go back down to Tavern 1 when we finally get our tourists. But yeah, there are a few more systems we need to test before we can start getting paying customers up into the hotel, as we will see a bit later on in the video. Yeah, I think it's safe to say we're not quite ready for the tourists yet. But with that, we have finished the hotel and transport system. You can see there as well, I have sent up a life support module, the same one that we use for the Valkyrie actually, just because it has so much food and water. It will last years before we need to replace that. But yeah, there's the hotel all done really. I'm sure it's got all of the amenities you'd want from a space hotel. Beautiful viewing galleries, lovely lavish rooms. I mean, maybe even a swimming pool if that's something that you could make work in zero gravity. Although I don't think our legal team would ever sign off on a zero-G swimming pool. Anyway, moving on. As I had said before, we are now ready to build actual SSTOs, so here is our first proper one, the Bismuth. Yes, this is a passenger jet designed to take up to 32 guests into low orbit, and we're just giving it a little test drive. There's Fozy coming, looking like she's having a horrible time. So we're using 6 of those Whiplash turbojet engines and 2 skippers for orbital insertion and maneuvering. After takeoff, I keep my heading at around 10 degrees. The reason for this is that I've angled the wings so that it should naturally tend to pull up. But also we need to spend as long in the atmosphere as possible because these Whiplash engines are actually most effective at high speeds. So we need a lot of time and a lot of atmosphere to pick up those kind of speeds that will help us get into orbit. And we'll have to convince all of our passengers that yes, the plane is actually meant to be on fire. When my velocity stops increasing, I activate the skippers, and you see I've pulled up the information on the turbojet there, just so I can see when the thrust drops off enough that it's worth turning the engines off. Incidentally, when I turn the engines off, I also close all of the intakes, just because that reduces the amount of drag, because now we just want as much speed as possible, and so drag is our enemy. When I was designing this plane, I had a look into what sort of wing profiles you want when traveling at supersonic speeds, and it turns out you don't really want wings at all. So drag is proportional to the square of the velocity that you're traveling, so that means the faster you go, your drag increases exponentially, produced by any wing or bit that sticks out of the plane. So really, when you're traveling at supersonic and hypersonic speeds, you want to keep your wings within the sort of aerodynamic profile of the plane. And what I mean by that is, as the nose cuts through the atmosphere, you can imagine it pushes the air around the plane. You want your wings within that sort of cone that produces. As soon as you stick out of that cone, well, you're going to be producing a lot more drag, and you've got another leading edge into the airstream, which could result in all sorts of aerodynamic instabilities, which, well, maybe we might see a bit of that later. This is a bit of a catch-22 situation because to be traveling at supersonic speeds, you first have to be traveling at subsonic speeds, and then you really do want wings to be producing your lift so that you can actually get your plane to fly. Anyway, look at that, we've made it into orbit, and now, yes, so I made a huge error. Here I ran out of electric charge, and I thought, oh, silly me, I forgot to deploy the solar panels as I was orbiting, waiting for a better chance to land at the Space Center, and then I realized, oh, I forgot to pack the solar panels, and now we're about to run out of electric charge. So that's probably not good for the life support systems that Fozy is sort of depending on right now. And there was me thinking, oh my god, what happens if we run out of oxygen? That was actually the least of my problems, as we will see a bit later on. So originally I wanted to wait until the Space Center was on the daytime side of the planet, but of course this kind of necessitated an immediate landing, so I thought, well, I'll just land in the dark and we'll have to make do. This was a bold attitude of hubris that I could, in fact, pick where I landed with this thing. I couldn't. Yeah, so as it turns out, if you run out of electric charge, you will have enough oxygen for a good few hours, so that wasn't the problem. What was the problem is that I had no stability assist, which, when you're traveling at hypersonic speeds through the atmosphere, is kind of something you rely upon. Especially when you design a spaceplane as I have, with a wingspan not suited for such speeds. You know, I designed these wings thinking primarily about takeoff and landing, gliding back to the Space Center for as little fuel as possible. Speaking of fuel, you'll see me pumping some of it forward into the front of the craft there. I wanted to be absolutely sure that the center of mass was in front of the center of lift because the fuel doesn't drain very consistently throughout the plane, so I just wanted to make sure it was aerodynamically stable. Which honestly was like trying to put a plaster on a dismemberment because it still wasn't stable by any meaning of the word there. I mean, it stayed nose forwards, to be fair, so that is stable, but you can see it's flipping completely out of control there. I was trying really hard to keep it under control, but yeah, oh, look at it go there. Yeah, I had absolutely no authority over this thing. As the realization was dawning on me that I really might not land this thing, I hovered my mouse over Fozy's icon down there to get ready with the EVA, and I noticed it was grayed out, so I was a bit worried and pulled up the menu for the cockpit there to see if I had to do it through there instead. I then realized actually the reason I wasn't allowed to EVA is because we're re-entering the atmosphere, and if I had pressed EVA then Fozy would have jumped out into hypersonic re-entry fire and, well, would have died immediately, a pretty horrible death. But by the good grace of the Kraken, or perhaps just my incredible piloting skills, the EVA wasn't necessary and we managed to regain control of the plane. I think, yeah, it's just unstable naturally at those hypersonic speeds because of the big wings. Should we have had stability assist on, that would not have been a difficult re-entry at all. But yeah, I was miles and miles away from the center. In fact, I was about a quarter of the planet away from the Space Center, so completely overshot my target, as usual, but I feel like this time it wasn't my fault. Anyway, here we are coming in for a landing. I misjudged how far away the water was, deployed my drogue chutes too early, and yeah, hit the water pretty hard, but nothing broke, and Fozy didn't die, so overall a pretty successful landing. Although we certainly want to make some modifications to this plane before we get any tourists in it. But all of those changes will have to wait until another episode. Until then, if you want to catch up with any of the older episodes, you can check out the playlist that this video is in. If you enjoyed the episode, please consider leaving a like and maybe even subscribing to the channel. But I've been Movefish1001 and I will see you in the next video.